22 августа. Хочу вам показать наши цены на бензинчик.
Russia's internal front is crumbling. Putin's entire gasoline and crude oil card is exploding inside the country. The wholesale price of I-95 gasoline in Russia hit a record high at the end of July. The government stopped gasoline exports on July 28th, but there are still long lines at gas stations, stretching from the Far East to the north and from rural areas to the suburbs. Now, in the fourth year of the war, Russia is trying to maintain its claim to be an energy superpower against the outside world, while undergoing a nerve test at the pump domestically. Prices are skyrocketing. Stations are imposing quotas. 95-octane gasoline is effectively unavailable in some regions, and lines are growing longer. Reports of kilometer-long queues emerged from Primoria. On the same day, refineries in Syzran, Novokuibyshevsk, Ryazan, and Volgograd were reported to have been hit or reduced capacity due to technical issues or security concerns. This is not merely a supply disruption. It is a multi-layered internal supply shock where refineries, pipelines, railway logistics, and budget constraints are all strained simultaneously. Ukraine's systematic attacks on refineries and pumping stations are triggering this shock. Despite Moscow's legal breaks, the laws of physics remain unchanged. Without functioning refineries and uninterrupted logistics, domestic pumps cannot be filled. So why are queues growing despite the export ban? The answer is simpler than you might think. Economic decisions cannot compensate for technical flaws on their own. Ukraine's deep strikes are disrupting refinery rhythms, maintenance windows are lengthening, fire/safety protocols are kicking in, and bottlenecks on pipelines and railways are widening. Domestic demand, meanwhile, is not falling due to seasonal factors and the war economy. Result: the ban is on paper, but there's new load at the pump. A Reuters report dated August 21st summarized this cycle in simple terms. Gasoline shortages in some areas, days when Russians couldn't find AI-95 in some places, kilometer-long queues in Primoria, and unrelenting supply pressure despite the government's July 28th gasoline export ban. The same report also includes the following detail: capacity declines in Syzran and Novokuibyshevsk following the attacks on Ukraine, outages and security concerns around Volgograd and Ryazan. The picture is completed by local contraction despite the export ban. So, how many regions run out of fuel when a single refinery shuts down? In a transcontinental country like Russia, the answer is several supply regions. Because refinery production is not as interchangeable or flexible a network as it is often assumed to be. Each facility supplies different stations and feeds different railway pipeline networks. Capacity declines along the Volga route, such as in Syzran and Novokuibyshevsk, strain stations in central Russia. Volgograd is critical for long-distance supplies, and even a one-day shutdown at a hub like Ryazan disrupts the rhythm of pumps hundreds of kilometers away. This chain reaction, despite the export ban, led to a breakdown in gasoline supply, resulting in direct gasoline station queues in Primoria and neighboring regions. Throughout 2025, a portion of Russia's major refineries, including Ryazan, Syzran, Novokuibyshevsk, and Volgograd, were intermittently offline. The common target of the disruptions was the critical units that convert crude oil into gasoline, diesel, and naphtha. Even a brief shutdown is enough to drain the pumps in several regions in succession. Then comes logistics. Internal supply chains, spanning thousands of kilometers along the west-east axis, rely on railway cars on the Trans-Siberian line, and in some places on pipelines. A delay at one point on the line turns into an announcement that a tanker has not arrived elsewhere. Local reports from the Far East, including Vladivostok, indicate that drivers can only purchase gasoline in 10-liter limits. Some stations have temporarily closed 95-octane fuel, and waiting times have increased, showing that the crisis has spread far beyond Moscow. These examples clearly illustrate how the supply shock is spreading in Russia's Far East. Meanwhile, Ukraine has targeted Druzhba 3 times in a row. Every load that arrives here puts additional pressure on Russia's domestic market. How can a single attack disrupt the rhythm of half a country? The pipeline is the key here. The western branch of the Druzhba system is part of both the flow to Europe and the internal transfer system. The Unica pumping station on this line was temporarily shut down after an attack. Following the third attack on the Onecha pumping station near Bryansk, Ukraine, on August 22nd, The suspension of flows to Hungary and Slovakia via the Druzhba pipeline has heightened the risk for Moscow in terms of both its external obligations and internal balancing. Even a one-day delay in external flows requires a complete overhaul of shipment plans. Every barrel redirected inward cannot simultaneously feed the railway pipeline backbone. In such a scenario, the government prioritizes allocations for the military and defense industry, leading to longer queues at civilian stations. The suspension of flows became even clearer with the Onechha attack. While such disruptions may appear to hit trade, the real impact is felt in the domestic market, because priority always goes to the military and strategic assets in times of crisis. Let's quantify how many stations a single refinery shutdown would darken. Syzran and Novokuibyshevsk carry the load of the Samara basin. When they falter, the Volga line shifts to secondary sources. Volgograd plays a frequently deployed buffer role. If the rhythm is disrupted here due to breakdowns, fires, or security issues, the south-central artery constricts. Ryazan is a nerve center for the Moscow region. A one-day slowdown there directly translates into delays for the city's suburbs. The export ban leaves more gasoline on paper for domestic use, but the reality is that if tankers, railways, and pipelines fail to deliver this gasoline to the right stations on time, the ban does not translate into gasoline at the pump. Why aren't prices falling? The wholesale price of AI-95 reached a record high of 76,293 rubles per ton by the end of July. This is a price signal of a supply shock. The ban alone is not enough to reverse the price curve. For the ban to work, refineries must operate, logistics must flow, hoarding must be discouraged, and regional imbalances must be addressed through rapid shipments. For domestic prices, even wholesale prices to decline, refinery uptime is required. This is not easily achievable amid the triangle of airstrikes, fires, and maintenance. There's a ban, no gasoline, and queues. Let's analyze the politics of this three-part scenario. When the Kremlin announced the gasoline export ban on July 28th, it presented it to the public as a precautionary measure. But what did the operators on the ground know at the same time? They knew that the repairs to the damaged, malfunctioning refineries could not be completed in the short term, that some lines would operate slowly due to security protocols, and that the supply of spare parts and experts would be delayed due to sanctions. The tomorrow message displayed on station screens therefore did not carry the same meaning in every city. In some places it meant one day, in others a week. What does the supply-demand curve tell us? Half of Russia experiences low temperatures for most of the year. This is not just about household fuel, but also winter logistics. Diesel and gasoline stocks are transported via frozen river and lake routes, seasonal roads, and the only supply window for remote settlements. A queue at the start of summer is merely annoying. A queue at the start of winter disrupts life. That's why every disruption seen in July and August disrupts planning for September and October. Declining stocks, delayed tankers, burning or stalled units compound the problem in November and December. Why is a 10-litre limit in the Far East a critical sign? Because Russia's fuel map is not linear, it is continental. A distribution elasticity is needed from western Siberia to the Ural Basin and then to the Pacific coast. When the wagon rotation and route plan in the Trans-Siberian corridor is delayed by a few days, drivers in Primorsky Krai are told, "I got 10 litres today, come back tomorrow." Field notes compiled by Kyiv Insider from the region, restricted stations, price volatility, and the unavailability of 95-octane fuel on some days truly demonstrate how much logistical flexibility has been reduced. This is not just a matter of fuel shortages happen, it is a fragile point in a war economy. What about the bigger picture? What is the Kremlin hearing from within? It is impossible for the Russian bureaucracy to ignore this. The economic management was already sounding the alarm at the beginning of the summer. The hypothermia warning voiced by Russian Economy Minister Maxim Reshetnikov at the end of May may have looked like a debate over nominal growth and monetary policy, but the subtext was clear. The economy is cooling. Vulnerability to shocks is growing. Under these conditions, if shocks hit basic goods like fuel, the supply-demand balance will turn into social tension. In other words, it was not just fuel, but the entire economic rhythm that was sounding the alarm. This alarm influenced the political groundwork for the decision to ban gasoline exports at the end of July. Now there are reports of kilometer-long queues in primary. There have been days when IE95 was unavailable. Some stations switched to limited sales. Some offered 92 octane while restricting 95. This scene is unfolding on this scale for the first time for Russia's 140 million population. If the shadow cast by the 1990s transformation crisis reappears at the pump, the result will not be mere nervousness. It will shatter social trust. Kilometer-long queues, supply shortages, regional imbalances. These are not just fuel shortages. They are red lines for internal legitimacy. Is the crisis biting not just at the pump, but also at the budget? Yes. Oil and gas revenues are declining due to sanctions, price ceiling regimes, discounted sales, and internal stock pressure. An analysis by the Moscow Times based on finance ministry data shows that oil and gas revenues fell by 19% year-on-year in the first 7 months of 2025, with particularly sharp declines in mineral extraction tax met collections. The weakening of revenues is reducing budget flexibility at a time when internal price controls are placing a subsidy-like burden on the refining and distribution chain. This makes long-term ceiling floor regimes in the domestic market difficult to sustain financially. Meanwhile, the EU's new shackles are also making it harder for Russia to recycle refined products. In mid-July, the EU agreed on the 18th package, which aims to crack down on the shadow fleet, tighten price caps, and prevent refined products derived from Russian crude from being circulated through third countries. On paper, this package appears to be an external trade issue. However, in practice, it also narrows the channels of flexibility in the domestic market. This is because as it becomes more difficult for Russian refined products to enter the European market under third country labels, Russia's vent for balancing its internal and external markets shrinks. When the valve shrinks, the pressure of shocks increases. Details of the EU's 18th package reported in the press confirm that restrictions on shadow fleets and derivative product flows have been tightened. What is the difference between "we imposed the ban, but it wasn't enough," and "we kept the stock, but it wasn't enough for the winter"? The first is a current political reflex, the second is strategic supply discipline. In Russia's north and far east, winter stocks are not merely a technical term. If stocks are insufficient in October-November, fuel in December-January will not only be expensive, it may physically be unavailable. That's why the queues seen today in Primory are a sign of risk tomorrow in Yakutsk. This signal is not just for civilians, it's equally critical for the military, police, and emergency response units. Because in a war economy, while the front lines take priority, internal security and local services also try to draw from the same stockpiles. The conflict between military and civilian priorities is invisible. It is felt at the pump. The allocation set aside for the Ministry of Defense, especially during hot days, reduces the share allocated to civilian stations. This is not announced by decree. It is evident in the rhythm of convoys, the sudden emptying of stations around garrisons, and the redirection of tenders. Kyiv's deep strike campaign did not merely target refineries to create a fire image. It exposed the tactical weaknesses of the supply chain week after week. Railway loading, unloading yards, pump stations, pipeline pump houses. As seen in the Unisa example in Bryansk, a blow to a pump results in days of recalibration. At that point, the priority list changes, which multiplies the tomorrow sign on civilian pumps. The narrative difference between 55% increase and record price shapes perception. While the financial press reports that II-95 has risen by over 50% since the beginning of the year, drivers on the road live by the instant figures on the sign. The fact that wholesale prices have reached record levels does not necessarily mean that the station will change its shelf price in the short term. However, it does affect replenishment costs and the station's decision to impose restrictions. So if the station's hose isn't running empty, drivers feel the economy bare. This feeling is not a choice, it's everyday life. It's not expected that 140 million people in Russia will meet in the same line on the same day, but the fact that several dozen regions are receiving similar signals in the same week shows that this is not economic news, but political climate. Queues are a trauma inherited from the 1990s. Their meaning is significant in the memory of those in power. That is why the July 28th ban was a verbal assurance. But as long as the global market and local mistakes do not allow it, the message at the pump cannot be changed. Russia has banned gasoline exports, but gasoline shortages and long queues continue in parts of the country. If pump station strikes and refinery shutdowns continue, as in Bryansk, the export ban will be extended, but the queues will not shorten. Moreover, Russia has seen this movie before. The government has kept on the agenda the extension of some restrictions until February 2025 and the continuation of export restrictions on producer companies. Turning down the export tap alone did not fill the pump because the pipeline and refinery are not breathing in unison. Overlay the EU's new framework on this picture. Squeezing the shadow fleet, restricting the entry of products derived from third-country refineries into Europe, and tightening price ceiling discipline will reduce the breath Russia can take in the external market. The 18th package summary clearly outlines restrictions on the shadow fleet and derivative refined products. This narrows the flexibility valve seen in the domestic market balance. What we call an internal explosion is exactly this. In an economy of 140 million people, gas stations come before grocery stores because they are essential for commuting, ambulance routes, fire department access, and the final link in logistics chains. If the queue starts here, it won't end anywhere else. So where does all this squeeze Putin? First, economic warnings were already on the table. Reshetnikov's hypothermia metaphor in May signaled that growth was cooling and that policies were vulnerable to a double shock. This is not a winter debate. It is a warning of an engine that won't warm up when the fuel shock began in the middle of summer. Second, domestic disruptions were known when the export ban was imposed at the end of July. The wholesale price of IE95 hit a new record that same week. Third, in the third week of August, Reuters reported on queues, shortages, and hit refineries in the same paragraph. This is field confirmation. When these three lines converge, the Kremlin's remaining policy maneuver is to manage the price and accelerate the security repair chain. But these could backfire at any moment depending on Ukraine's deep strike timeline. So what will Russia face heading into winter? Refinery uptime, pipeline railway security, replenishment frequency per station, and regional symmetry. Uptime means the speed of repairs. Speed means the availability of spare parts and experts. Experts are more expensive and slower under sanctions. Pipeline railway security means the rhythm of drone threats. As long as the rhythm doesn't slow down, there's no such thing as full protection. Refueling frequency per station measures the reality of tomorrow. Symmetry tells us whether we'll see the queue in primary in Moscow as well. 3 of these 4 variables are outside the realm of politics. 1 is tied to the attack schedule on the ground, 1 to the supply chain, and 1 to domestic security capacity. If refinery uptime does not increase by September-October, the cycle of attacks on critical nodes in the railway pipeline network continues, and the EU's new package proves less effective than expected in curbing shadow channels. The queues we saw this summer will be just a preview. In winter, restricted sales could become a daily occurrence in northern and eastern regions. At that point, the picture will no longer be just an economic one. It will become a matter of internal security. Reshetnikov's hypothermia metaphor will take on its true meaning. The economy will not just cool down, its arteries will constrict. The pump works like a heart. If its beat slows down, the body gets cold. This is a politically dangerous biological analogy, but the station hose is currently the only indicator of this biology. Reuters. Let's close with 3 fixed points on the ground. First, the July 28th gasoline export ban is in effect and has been implemented, but the queues have not ended. Second, the wholesale price of I-95 hit a record high at the end of July. This is a price signal of a supply shock. Third, Ukraine's deep strike chain is delivering regular blows to the refinery and pump station equation. When these 3 constants align, the news bulletin, gasoline is gone, internal front, ceases to be a headline and becomes everyday life in a country of 140 million. In summary, Russia is exploding from within, because the war economy must distribute fuel not only to the front lines, but also to the millions who turn their ignitions every morning from the same storage tanks and the same pipelines. And those tanks and pipelines are now being tested every day. For Putin, the siege is not at the border this time, it is at the pump. Thank you for watching.